So obviously anyone who watches my channel knows I talk about Ubisoft games a lot. Mainly Assassin's Creed, but I also have made quite a bit of content surrounding Far Cry, Watch Dogs, Ghost Recon, and plenty of other Ubisoft series. And through the years of playing these games, I feel I've started to notice a trend in a lot of the storytelling of the games, especially in more recent years, that in my opinion feels like a regression from some of the stories we got from Ubisoft games 10 plus years ago. Now it's not like that applies to every game, there's the rare exception every now and again, but there are certain issues I've noticed in a lot of these games. And even though many of these stories were written by different groups of writers over the many different Ubisoft studios, these stories still share a lot of similar issues. Now I don't think the storytelling in Ubisoft games was ever perfect or completely masterful and revolutionary, but there were some games back then that I felt were able to tell some really bold, creative, and compelling stories. And for a while, I thought maybe because I've gotten older and played so many other games now, is why the stories in the newer Ubisoft games have felt worse than the older ones. You know, the whole blind nostalgia thing. But since I've replayed some of those games and stories I loved when I was younger, and they still hold up. So what exactly about the storytelling in these newer Ubisoft titles feels like a regression in quality from some of the stories we used to get, like in games such as Far Cry 3 or Assassin's Creed 2? Well, I feel one of the major things I've noticed, especially in the last few years with Ubisoft games, is the stories are starting to feel incredibly generic. In fact, it really hit me when I played Ubisoft's most recent major release, and was actually what inspired me to make this video, Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora. It feels like all of these stories have started to adhere to this formula of storytelling, and a lot of them have started to feel the same. I actually think the series where this issue has become the most prevalent is Far Cry, and Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora, a game that borrows quite a lot from the Far Cry formula, I feel has fallen victim to some of the same issues when it comes to storytelling. I still firmly believe Far Cry 3 has one of, if not the best story I've seen from a Ubisoft game, and it's like every Far Cry game since then has just tried to replicate the magic of that lightning in a bottle that Far Cry 3 captured, which is why those games have started to feel so generic and repetitive. Voss became so popular and iconic that they had to try and replicate him with a big villain on the cover of the game every time. I've pointed this out numerous times before too, but every game seems to follow a very similar rebellion plot. You play as some sort of rebel or revolutionary against the big tyrant and his army, who controls a massive region you must liberate from their control. I just described the plot of Far Cry's 4 through 6, and even Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora as well. Obviously it worked before in the series, which is why they keep doing it, but eventually it just ends up feeling very generic and bland. Far Cry 6 in particular was a game I was really looking forward to, especially with Giancarlo Esposito and having a voiced protagonist again, but the story just felt incredibly generic and underwhelming to me. I could say pretty much the exact same thing with Watch Dogs Legion, for example. I really like the first two games. Tonally, they are very different from one another, but both unique and interesting in their own way. I especially love the first game. The darker tone with the whole vigilante type storyline as Aiden Pierce really spoke to me. But then Watch Dogs Legion's story came out and felt like an extremely generic Ubisoft story. And the fact that there's no real protagonist of the story certainly didn't help it much either. The best part about Watch Dogs Legion is the Bloodlines DLC with Aiden Pierce and Wrench, which I think says a lot. Earlier, I mentioned that I believe Far Cry 3 was possibly my favorite story out of any Ubisoft title, and that's because it was very different and unique from any other Ubisoft game I've played. And it's a type of story I hadn't really experienced in another video game. It has deeper meaning and themes to it, and it broke a lot of common tropes and Ubisoft stereotypes. One of which is with its main character, Jason Brody. Jason Brody's character definitely classifies as an anti-hero. He lacks many of the qualities you come to expect out of a traditional hero, and his arc from rich, selfish playboy to vicious killer is such a dark but interesting character arc, and it's one that we haven't really seen in many other Ubisoft games or video games in general. It's a story about a man who effectively loses himself on this island full of killers and becomes one himself. It starts out as a necessity for his survival, but he starts to not only seek out violence and death, but actually enjoys and relishes in it. And this came out at a time where there was this big narrative about whether or not violent video games inspire real-life violence. There was this deep underlying theme to Far Cry 3, and it showed what would happen when an average ordinary person is put into a kill or be killed situation. That paired with the iconic performance and villain of Voss, Far Cry 3's story is just lightning in a bottle. It was bold, it was unique, and it's not the type of story you may typically expect from a Ubisoft game. And as I've said before in a previous video, anti-hero protagonists are my favorite type of protagonist to play as. The moral dilemmas and questionable choices they make, and the discussions you can have about whether or not what they did was justified, makes those characters so much more interesting and fascinating to me. They feel a bit more human, realistic, and multi-layered as well. And as messed up as this may sound, I get tired of always playing as the good guy. Sometimes it's really fun to be the villain or play as a morally gray character. Some of my favorite video game protagonists of all time are like that, such as Joel Miller or Kratos. Hence why I like characters like Aiden Pierce or even more recently Basm so much as well. They definitely fall under what I'd consider an anti-hero. I want to see more characters like that in Ubisoft games, or at the very least shake things up and give us a different type of story. Don't be afraid to have good characters do bad things. With that aside, another more prevalent issue I've found in more recent Ubisoft stories is the use of comedy. Now, I'm not saying these games should have no comedy whatsoever, because who doesn't like to have a good laugh every now and again, but in my opinion, some of these games really need to ramp it down a couple notches. A lot of Ubisoft games have that Marvel-like humor from some of those recent movies, if you know what I'm talking about, where there's just constant jokes and quips.
Hello, I see you.
That can oftentimes just be more annoying than charming or funny, sometimes even undercutting what should be an emotional and serious moment. Again, not every Ubisoft game has this issue. AC Mirage didn't have a whole lot of comedy, but games like Far Cry 6, Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and Valhalla, I feel like they just completely overdo it at times with the comedy and goofiness. In Avatar, there were so many quirky, annoying human characters in that game that I just couldn't stand. Priya is a perfect example. The writing for a character was just so cringy, and you can tell they wanted these characters to be charming, but instead they come off as extremely annoying and unlikable. So many Ubisoft games have characters like this. I just played the Skull and Bones beta not too long ago, and there were several characters that acted like this too. I'm not saying you can't have comic relief characters, but can we please at least tone it down and give them some better quality dialogue? And again, I feel like a lot of these games have started to lack any deeper themes or meanings. The stories feel hollow. If a story can't make you feel any kind of emotion or engage you in any meaningful way, then you're going to be left feeling just flat out bored while watching it unfold, which is how I felt while playing some of these games from the past 5 years or so. Again, not to insist that's every game. There's some exceptions like Assassin's Creed Origins. I for the most part was pretty into Far Cry 5's story and AC Mirage, but too many of these stories just fail to deliver much in the way of substance. There's also been a lack of creativity in some of these games and stories, which I already made a video on a while back, so I won't go too deep into that. But all this to say, I definitely feel the storytelling of Ubisoft games has regressed rather significantly over the years. I think the biggest issue is with how generic and similar they've all started to feel. Long gone are the days where we got stories like Ezio's or the dark, twisted mind of Jason Brody. Some people may not play these games for the story, but to me it's still one of the most important foundational pieces to any single player narrative driven experience. And when the story suffers from problems, the whole game does too. I think these newer Ubisoft games and stories need to break away from their typical generic formulas, and not be afraid to deliver something a bit more bold and unique. That's how you end up with a story like Far Cry 3's. Not to say Ubisoft's storytelling was ever perfect, but I definitely feel like overall, 10 plus years ago, I generally found the stories of the games easier to become invested in and engaged with. So hopefully Ubisoft can crack open the creative piggy bank and deliver something a bit different. I have heard the leaks about the next Far Cry game, and the plot of it already sounds very different from what we've gotten recently. No rebellion plot, finally, so fingers crossed there. But let me know what you guys think about all this. Do you feel Ubisoft's storytelling has regressed over the years? And if so, what do you think can be done to right the ship? As always, if you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you left a like and considered subscribing to the channel if you're new. A special thank you to my members for supporting me, and other than that, thanks for watching, and have a great rest of your day, everyone.